delegations of US members of Congress to the region to try to see the impacts on the ground of what US policy was doing and advocate for a shift away from funding militarism. And later on, we were involved in supporting a partner organization in Guatemala who were documenting war crimes and genocide that had been committed by the military there during Guatemala's civil war. But our work in Central America didn't pick up recently in a big way until 2014. That was the start, as you may recall, of a crisis of unaccompanied children arriving at the border in large numbers from Central America. And while this was a humanitarian crisis in its own right, I think it's perhaps best understood as a second generation refugee crisis that was in many ways created by the same US policies that caused the first wave of refugees in the 1980s. So specifically, Central American refugees who arrived in the US in the 80s who were fleeing civil wars and dictatorships that our government was funding often arrived in cities that were already riven by violence between different ethnic groups. And some young men formed street gangs originally as a form of self-protection. And when US deportation policies changed in the 1990s, those same young men were deported in large numbers, sent back to countries they barely knew with no job prospects or economic futures. And these small street gangs were turned into transnational criminal networks as a result. This led to a crisis of violence and political instability that still continues in Central America today. And so the gangs that we may have heard of that are constantly being demagogued on right-wing media, things like MS-13, those gangs actually had their origin in the United States. And I think we could say that it was our government's policies that created them. So when UUSC's research partners spoke to some of the unaccompanied children who were arriving in 2014, many had similar stories to tell about their reasons for migrating in the first place. Many had parents and relatives in the US who were part of the first group of refugees in the 80s, and these children were hoping to reunite with them. Many were facing extreme poverty and deprivation, and many were fleeing violence, abuse, and forced recruitment at the hands of the gangs. While these may seem like different reasons for migrating, in many children's cases, they were deeply interconnected, was something that our research partners found. Children with relatives in the United States are more likely to be targeted for kidnapping and extortion by the gangs in the first place. And so too, families whose small businesses are struggling are more likely to be attacked by the gangs for being unable to pay extortion money that the gangs demand. So as UUSC looked in 2014 for ways to respond to this crisis and spoke to partners, we began to understand that this was really not about the so-called border. This was really a regional crisis with deep roots in our shared history throughout Meso and North America. We also realized that refugees themselves, as well as members of civil society throughout the region, were stepping up and organizing themselves to address this crisis, which our governments had created and failed to solve. So in collaboration with grassroots partners throughout Central America, Mexico, and the United States, UUSC developed a threefold strategy that we're continuing to implement today. We're focusing on the right to stay safely at home in Central America, the right to be safe in transiting between borders, and we recognize that those are an artificial, colonialist construct to start with, and the right to due process and asylum here in the United States. So we advance this strategy through three dimensions of our work. As a philanthropic foundation, we provide funding to grassroots partners working on innovative solutions and who are led by and for the communities most affected. As a UU-inspired organization, we also offer experiential learning and mobilizing opportunities for UU congregations and other faith communities. We do this through the College of Social Justice, which offers experiential learning trips, and also our CAPAS program, which supports UUs who are providing accompaniment to asylum seekers who are going through the immigration court process. And finally, as an advocacy organization, we provide research and mobilize our members nationally to support the human rights goals that our partners identify, including the right to asylum and the other priorities discussed above. So I wanted to share just a couple examples of some of the partners we're currently working with. Here in Nicaragua, we're working with the Fundación Entre Mujeres, or the Foundation Among Women, who are a women-led farming cooperative. We're working to present an alternative model of community-led economic development that sustains people's livelihoods long-term. And here you can see some photos. I think my colleague, Lindsay Homan, who is our senior partnership officer for Migrant Justice, for sharing some of these slides. In Guatemala, we're working with Asociación Pop No, and they are led by and for indigenous Maya youth in a rural region of the country. Many of the young people they work with have previously been deported from the United States and are struggling to reintegrate in society, find work, and particularly under COVID, there's renewed threats of stigma and the potential for violence in trying to previously deported people trying to reintegrate in their communities. In Mexico, our partners are at the Scalabrinianas mission for refugees and migrants, are providing legal aid, shelter, and accompaniment to migrants on their journey, which through Mexico has been extremely dangerous part of the trip for migrants facing extortion and other threats. It's certainly become worse under current conditions due to the complete shutdown of asylum processing here in the United States and the resulting growth of refugee camps on the border in Mexico. So that brings me to the situation. Here's a little bit more photos, but that brings me to the situation in our country here, where I'm sorry to say our work, as you all know, has become even more difficult in just the last few years. I think my co-panelist Ray is planning to talk in more detail about what's happening legally with the asylum and accessing the right to asylum in this country. But it's a very ugly picture at the moment. And I think it can be said that we're at something of an all-time low, at least in recent history, in terms of refugee and immigrant rights in this country. But it's also true that that doesn't mean that these problems all started with the Trump administration. So as I mentioned, UUSC began our recent work in Central America actually under the Obama administration, when Obama was still in power, and their administration was really not good or consistent allies on immigrant rights or asylum or these interconnected issues. After the 2014 border crisis started, the Obama administration responded by reintroducing family detention. So detaining family units together, which was previously a Bush administration program that had been shuttered. And they also put in place what we call border externalization, where they tried to induce other governments in the region to block refugees along their journey before they could get here, thus preventing them from gaining due process protections in our asylum system. So this was similar to an interdiction policy that the US had previously used to bar Haitian refugees at sea, basically intercepting people before they can get to the border and access protections here. So all these policies, along with the administration's deportations in general, were part of what they saw at the time as a grand political compromise, where they thought they could prove to congressional Republicans that they were, quote unquote, serious about, quote unquote, securing the border, and that then they'd be able to pass comprehensive immigration reform as a result. But clearly, I think from our current perspective, we can see that that policy failed and caused a huge amount of suffering. I'd argue that it also indirectly lent credence to the right-wing narrative that was trying to present Central American asylum seekers as a threat. And ultimately, it helped to normalize the even worse abuses that the current administration has inflicted. And so that takes us to the present, whereas we know we've really reached a low point. So over the past 4 years, we've seen this administration chip away at every form of temporary protection from deportation, DACA, deferred and forced departure, or DDD, and so on. This includes ending temporary protected status, or TPS, for hundreds of thousands of immigrants. This was a program that protects people from being deported to countries that are experiencing humanitarian crisis, including natural disasters and conflicts, and several Central American countries previously had TPS. So we've seen this administration disrupt every possible pathway to asylum and protection from deportation. And now with the COVID-19 pandemic, they've basically used the disease as a pretext to shut down the immigration system entirely. We have to think for a moment about how enormous of a change that is. They've passed categorical bans on employment and family-based green cards. They've ground all refugee resettlement to a halt, and they've imposed what are called Title 42 expulsions on asylum seekers and unaccompanied children who arrive at the border. What this means in practice is that people are turned away instantly at the border without any due process, regardless of their need for protection. And this policy is being implemented against unaccompanied children of any age. This violates a host of different US laws and international agreements, but the administration is claiming the power to do this under a public health pretext. They actually got the CDC to sign off on this idea, but recent reporting from the past 2 weeks has shown that this policy was actually enforced over the objections of public health officials internal to the administration. It was basically forced through by Mike Pence and Stephen Miller and other people who have seen this pandemic as a opportunity to impose their immigration agenda or anti-immigration agenda that would otherwise be politically intolerable. And I think what's even more disturbing to me than just the breadth of these policies is how they've been implemented with almost no real public outcry. The horrific family separation policy that happened in 2018 was met with rallies and sustained public opposition that eventually led to a change. But here we are, and unaccompanied children are being picked up at the border and sent back to danger without due process, and there's stunningly little attention being paid to it. I think back to the Where Are the Children protests that people made in 2018, and I think we need to be asking that same question again. I've been struck by how we're less than a month from Election Day, and this expulsions policy has not even been a topic of discussion among the candidates or in any of the debates. But fortunately, people are organizing to fight back against these policies. UUSC, one of our partners, is the National TPS Alliance, and one of their press conferences is shown here. They're organizing with people from all 13 of the countries that have been impacted by the termination of temporary protected status. It's really a courageous effort in solidarity across very different national and linguistic groups who share this interest in common in saving the TPS program. And so they're actually touring the United States right now on a journey for justice. If you go to their website at the National TPS Alliance, you can find the map of where they're going to be and show up in your own community when they arrive. So they're seeking to raise awareness about this administration's policy, and we urge you to offer support. Some of the leaders of the TPS Alliance have also been active in drafting a migrant justice platform that outlines their short and long-term goals for future administrations. So that brings me to the subject of our shared advocacy going forward and how our many organizations represented here can support some shared outcomes. So first, in the immediate term, we obviously need to focus on undoing the damage of the current administration and the current migratory regime that we have in this country. So we and our partners are calling for a future administration to implement deferred and forced departure, or DED, on day one. They could extend this to countries that currently, to immigrants from countries that currently have TPS, to DACA holders, and to nationals of other countries that are in the midst of humanitarian crisis. And this would provide a really important short-term shield from deportation while Congress can work on a long-term path to permanent residency and citizenship. We need to restore asylum protections as they're written in US law. So we need to end this Title 42 policy and the Remain in Mexico policy and all these other systems that have been set up to prevent people from reaching asylum here in the US. And we need to reverse a number of other policies, including the travel ban and public charge regulation that are designed to restrict access to the country to immigrants of color. And then long-term, we really need to look at the deeper roots of the problem in the system as a whole, and that really takes thinking in more transformative terms. And the list I have here is very far from full transformation, and is not the full extent of what we need. But some ideas that come to mind and that our partners have identified in the Migrant Justice Platform include we need to radically scale back funding for the out-of-control detention and deportation agencies that we have in this country. We need to fix or get rid of the 1996 law that led to the massive growth of the detention industry in this country and that created the expedited removal system that has made it so difficult to access asylum for many. And we need to decriminalize border crossing and get rid of the laws that impose criminal penalties on nonviolent immigration-related border crossings that were used to inflict things like the family separation policy in the first place. And that is just a start, of course, and I'm sure my co-panelists have a lot of other insights to share about how to change the system and where we can work together to create a better future from here. So I'm going to leave it there for now from the UUSC perspective.
Thank you, Josh. Is there a way to, at some point, not necessarily right this moment, but to get a text transcript of what you presented there? It had some really good stuff there, and I didn't get everything down.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Okay.
I'd be happy to share.
Thank you.
Deb, we're also providing a transcript of the summit through the live.
Okay. Thank you. Ray, you want to introduce yourself and then tell us a little bit about what Kitsap is doing and some of the special projects that you're looking at.
Okay, well, first of all, Josh, I want to thank you for the work you all are doing. I wasn't that aware of it, and I look forward to talking to you some more about what you're doing, because it really coincides very well with what we're trying to do. So we're a small nonprofit. We're located in Bremerton, Washington, and we have an office in Port Townsend. The Kitsap Immigrant Assistance Center was started in 2004 by a couple of women who were volunteering with our county's health district, helping Latino families who needed help with various things. And for several years, they operated in church basements and rooms they could acquire, and they kind of moved about. They were sort of a gypsy center, I called them. In 2009, we got a little more organized and started a board of directors, became a 501c3. And in 2014, we recognized, after meeting with so many people in our community, that there was a great need for legal help, and that there was hardly anyone in our county who was providing immigration law. support to the people who needed it. So we found out about a program that allowed people who were not attorneys to become what are called accredited representatives. And by doing that, we're recognized by the Department of Justice, and I say justice in quotes, to practice immigration law at various levels. We started out doing things that help people apply for various benefits through USCIS, United States Citizenship and Immigration Services. And they were primarily helping people to study, apply for, and then gain citizenship in the United States, or to apply for adjustment of status, which is the legal term for people acquiring a green card. We also did some representation for victims of various crimes through the U-Visa program. And as word got out that we were doing this, we had more and more people approach us who were in removal proceedings. They were trying to apply for various forms of relief after being placed in removal proceedings. So in 2017, I became what's called fully accredited. So I'm authorized to represent people in immigration court and before the Board of Immigration Appeals. By that time, we had 12 of us who were accredited representatives. Every one of us is a volunteer. So all the direct legal services that our organization provides are provided by volunteers. We also recognized that although Kitsap County had a great need, there were also needs in surrounding communities. So we expanded our service area to cover Jefferson, Clallam, and North Mason counties. So we represent people, a lot of people in Forks, Washington, which is up on the northwest corner of Washington State, down through Shelton, which is in Mason County, and then Kitsap and Jefferson counties in between. We also have a family services component that provides essentially social services to people who may or may not be in removal proceedings. They have stepped up to this crisis, and now one of the things that we do is provide rent assistance and food assistance to families from Forks through Belfair on a weekly basis. I guess the thing that struck me most in listening to Josh was the root of where a lot of what we're dealing with now came from, because it is a situation that our country caused. And being essentially on the front lines, having to go to court with the people that I work for on a regular basis, I've gotten to know a lot of them personally, and I've got to learn a lot about what life was like in the countries that they came from. About 90% of the clients that we're representing in removal proceedings right now are from Guatemala, but because the southern border seems to be a place that a lot of people from around the world navigate to before trying to seek asylum in the United States, we've represented people from several countries in Africa and Eastern Europe. And the common comment I hear from all of them, and this is more now than it was in the beginning, is that they thought they were coming to a country that was going to welcome them and try to give them salvation from the situation that they had fled from. And they're all deeply disappointed by what they found instead. So I was going through this morning a list of all the executive orders and the rule changes that USCIS and the Executive Office of Immigration Review and ICE and Customs and Border Patrol have done over the past few years. There are 48 major changes that they have made in the rules and regulations, along with several decisions that the attorney generals, both Sessions and Barr, have made over the past couple of years. And you don't have to be a liberal or anti-administration to read these things and realize that the whole point of these changes is to stop people from immigrating to our country. So I just wanted to go through a few of those with you because I think they really illustrate what's happening here. And maybe all of you know this already, but this is the world we deal with. And, you know, I'll tell you, I don't think a week goes by now that I don't get a notification from one of those agencies that they are adding another rule or they are changing a rule to make things harder for people to immigrate here, or to make things harder for people to gain asylum, or to make things harder for people who have been through a hearing with a judge and trying to gain asylum and have appealed it to the Board of Immigration Appeals, to make it almost impossible for that appeal to go through. So I look back at 2017. In 2017, Trump issued a Border Security and Immigration Enforcement Improvements Edict that essentially is the roadmap for most of what has happened since then. In February of 2017, USCIS changed the way it did credible fear interviews. So a credible fear interview is what a person goes through when they come to our border and say that they are afraid to return to their country and that they're seeking asylum. Immigration officers in USCIS, that are called asylum officers, are trained in great detail on how to interview people to determine whether or not they actually have a credible fear of persecution in their home country. And that training takes months. It's very detailed, and it is renewed on a very regular basis. In the past year or 2 years ago, the administration decided that it was going to allow Customs and Border Patrol agents, who are essentially cops, to do credible fear interviews. They have no training to do this, and they are making decisions about people's lives that essentially say if they don't pass their credible fear interview, they're going to be deported. So you have people who don't have the training, don't have the expertise, and I'm sure many of them don't care, interviewing people who are trying to come here because they've been persecuted in their home countries. And so I think about a statement that a former immigration judge made about what this whole program is about. And he said, the asylum process, the immigration court process, is like conducting a death penalty trial in traffic court. I mean, it's just, it's a hard thing to fathom. So, you know, you go through month after month. In June of 2018, Attorney General Sessions took a case that the Board of Immigration Appeals was deciding, and he can certify cases to himself to make decisions about them. So he took this case. It was a case of a woman who had been a victim of domestic violence in a Central American country. And he wrote a decision that essentially tried to say that victims of domestic violence and victims of gang violence probably don't deserve asylum, and encouraged immigration judges not to grant asylum to people who present cases like that. He overturned a precedential decision that had been made several years ago that did allow people who are victims of those kinds of situations to apply for and gain asylum. Following that, Attorney General Barr has made two really critical decisions about people who are applying for asylum. One of them deals with the fact that if you are the member of a family that has been persecuted, you can use that as part of your argument for why you should be granted asylum. And he essentially said, no, that isn't the case. And then just recently, he came up with another ruling that essentially took those two rulings, the one from Sessions and his earlier one around families, and just reinforced them in a way that makes it harder for us to argue for people to get asylum. So we have 68 cases that we're arguing right now in immigration court for people who are applying for asylum. And about half of them are for young people. And in many cases, the case that we had put together was based on either domestic violence or gang violence, because in the areas that these people came from, those are very predominant. All of them are Mayans. So they're people who are indigenous to their country, but have really experienced persecution because they are indigenous. And so the roadblocks that the administration has put up are going to make it much, much harder for us to argue these cases and win. And of course, the next thing that we would do if we have an immigration judge deny the asylum application is appeal that decision to the Board of Immigration Appeals, the BIA. Well, in the past few months, the administration's come out with several rules that makes it harder to do that. One of them just has to do with finances. So right now, if you appeal a case to the Board of Immigration Appeals, it costs $110. There is a potential for a waiver, but $110 is not prohibitive, even if in some cases we wind up paying it for the person. But they've just come out with a rule that has raised that fee to, I believe it's $1,140. So everybody that I work for, all the people that I represent in immigration court, cannot come up with $1,140 to pay for an appeal. I mean, we do our work pro bono, so they are not paying us at all. And if they had to pay $1,140, they wouldn't appeal because they couldn't afford to pay for it. The other thing to remember is that the vast majority of people who are in removal proceedings seeking asylum or applying to the BIA for an appeal are not represented by anybody. They're what's called pro se. And so along with the challenges of putting together an argument for why they should be granted asylum, now they are faced with additional costs, additional barriers in the form of costs. So on top of that, the BIA is also making it harder for people to qualify to even make an appeal. So they are setting up guidelines that say if you don't meet certain criteria, if the immigration judge has decided in a certain way, then you may not even be able to appeal your case to the Board of Immigration Appeals. And that is That's when I go back to the comment about these proceedings being like doing death sentences in traffic court. Because for a person who is applying for asylum, their path to get there, if their immigration judge denies their application, is through the Board of Immigration Appeals. And then if the Board of Immigration Appeals denies it, they have recourse to apply for an appeal through the Ninth Circuit, the Court of Appeals. But if they can't get to the Board of Immigration Appeals in the first place, they're not going to be able to get to the Ninth Circuit. And in many cases, the Ninth Circuit overturns denials that the Board of Immigration or an immigration judge has made. So it's a good circuit to be in. It's probably the best circuit in the United States in terms of being in removal proceedings as an immigrant. But again, the roadmap that Trump set up in 2017 is being implemented in a way that makes it harder and harder and harder for people in this situation to get the due process that they deserve. So one of the things that we're thinking about in our center is what happens after this regime is voted out of office next month, or what happens if it's not. So what happens if it's not, essentially to me looks like more of what we've seen over the past 3.5 years, which will pretty much say the United States is not a place that you can apply for asylum in. You need to think about another country because the rules are going to be so bad, whether or not they conform to what the law says, that people will just not even think about trying here. So that's one scenario. The other scenario is that we have a new administration, which is hopefully, and in that case, although we don't know exactly what's going to happen, what we anticipate is a massive rush of people who have been stuck on the border for months or years coming into the United States and seeking help. And I think Josh mentioned it's not the rules and the laws that they have put in place in the past 3.5 years aren't going to go away instantly. It's going to take a lot of work to undo the work that this administration has done. But in the meantime, we're going to have thousands of people who maybe finally get in here and are seeking help, and the resources to serve them just aren't there. I mean, I have 68 clients that I'm representing now, and I will take more on that I can, but in terms of the need, the resources are just too scant. So one of the things I'm hoping is we are going to be able to find ways to increase our capacity so we can serve people. I appreciate your time.
Well, wow. Thank you, Ray. Thank you very much. That's that's a pretty unique perspective to be able to share. Thank you. Rosalinda?
Thank you. And thank you for laying out all of the structure that this government and this country has created for immigration in the recent years. I want to thank all of the Unitarian fellowships and all your organizations for inviting me to present here today and for listening. I'm sitting in my family home in Lacona, Washington, on the lands of the Swinomish people, and again, trying to do our work with this COVID pandemic and the smoke and everything that's happened this year, which has been very difficult. But I wanted to also thank the Bellingham Unitarian Fellowship for all of their years of almost 15 years of support for our organization and the immigrant community in Whatcom County, and for the amazing partnership that we have formed together to really strategize and work together to provide some very basic human rights. And also Solidarity response to 3 major raids in Whatcom County beginning in 2006 and ending in 2018. Each one of those raids had, the first 2 raids had over 28 families impacted, and the last one, 16 families impacted. So we're very familiar. Whatcom County sits on the northwesternmost sector of the Homeland Security with one of the largest sector chiefs, sector offices, and a very top leadership sector chief of Homeland Security in Blaine, Washington, at the border crossing there. So we're at the center of Homeland Security oversight and enforcement of immigration law. They cover, I believe, Alaska, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, maybe even Montana. I'll have to double check that. But it's a huge Homeland Security operation. It's basically a military operation that has Black Hawk helicopters. They also cooperate and collaborate with the Coast Guard, the FBI, the the firearms, and I can't remember the name of the agency that looks at that has the firearms and drug enforcement, and I mean almost every federal agency has a place or an office and jurisdiction in our home county. So we have been community to community, has been advocating for the rights of farm workers and immigrant families in Whatcom County since 2003, beginning with a huge fight against the Minimum Project, who sought to develop a program and a project on the northern border to assist the Border Patrol and Homeland Security in the capture of illegal aliens and protect the country from terrorism and terrorist attacks from illegal aliens in Whatcom County, in one of the most peaceful borders in the world. The northern border of the United States still is one of the most peaceful borders in the world. And so they set up vigilante operations, and we worked really hard to stop them, and we did. We defeated them. It took 2 years, but we managed to defeat them, and they disbanded. But that campaign gave us all a very important knowledge of the structure between local law enforcement, Homeland Security, and the Border Patrol in Whatcom County. From that campaign, our work continued to build in Whatcom County, building solidarity and relationships with many organizations and the farm worker community and the immigrant community to protect our rights. Out of that fight, we continued our work, and we developed our program area at community to community for all of this work. It's called the Dignity Campaign. And the Dignity Campaign is basically protecting the rights of immigrant workers and immigrant families, but also within that exists a huge component of participatory democracy, because basically what you have both described is a fascist legal structure that has existed since immigration law was developed. Immigration law from the very beginning was built on a capitalist, white, patriarchal, racist, principles and values of this country. So from the very beginning, immigration law was meant to keep people of different cultures, different ethnicities, and different color skin out of the country unless they were needed for something. Like the Chinese workers during the railroads, the Filipino workers in California. I mean, you can go on and on, the different types. The Mexican workers came in during World War II when the United States was fighting fascism in Europe. And out of this has created slowly over time, and sometimes not so slowly, as we can see with the Trump administration, more and more legal restrictions to, in our opinion, create a legal slavery resource for the agricultural industry and now for many other industries. So immigrant workers are allowed into the United States if they're needed in the United States. This is a tradition of this country. And immigrant workers and families come here with the idea that they're coming to a free country, because the messaging that goes out and what we all talk about is this amazing country that you can still live the American dream. And for many years, we could still do that in spite of the immigration law. And I believe that we could still do that because of the goodness of the American people at the local level, allowing the opportunity for families like mine to maybe not have full equitable rights to resources and opportunities, but at least to exist, to be left alone, to deal, lift ourselves up by our own bootstraps and succeed if we could, which was not that easy. And I mean, I could go into many, many stories about that, including how Mexican farm workers helped to build the corporate agricultural industry for 2 or 3 generations now, which is why the agricultural industry is so powerful, both politically and monetarily, financially. So what did we, our organization, how we work with our community is really looking at that interconnectedness that you have mentioned. The fact that we are human beings. We are people, we're immigrants, but we're human beings just like you. We have the same needs and the same aspirations, and we are in your community. And like I tell many of our friends in Whatcom County, and those that are not our friends, whether you like me or not, or you accept me or not, I have decided, my family and myself and others, that this is our community, that this is our country, that we do belong here, and that you are my community. And as such, I have a right, and I have a human right and a privilege to question you in my community about how you treat my people and myself. And I claim the Constitution of this country that says that nobody in this country is illegal. The Constitution says that every person in this country has the rights to a free voice, to exist, and to be a human being. It's still in writing. And I think that a lot of immigration laws, what you both have mentioned, these tweaks and legal structures that have been tweaking and changing, is leading towards that place of changing the Constitution to really transform this country into the fascist nation that many white capitalists in this country really want. They want their privilege, they want their ability to succeed, but they also need workers and labor, and they need a subservient population that can fulfill some of those needs. And that has been proven even closer to that by how quickly laws and regulations and culture can be shifted as the need arises. As in what just happened in March, where essential workers were named. And who are those essential workers that were named, that were allowed to continue working, that were allowed to, do what they needed to do in the workplace, to continue earning their meager paychecks, mostly low-wage immigrant workers and brown and black people that have to continue doing the types of work that is needed, the delivery people, the farm workers especially is what I know, right? But other folks that are still continuing to work never stopped working at all. And the fact that there aren't enough regulations, even in this country, to protect those essential workers, because it wasn't in the interest of this nation to protect those essential workers. It was in the interest to keep them working. And so you will know, and we noticed in Whatcom County, that Homeland Security kind of backed off a little bit in the raids on workers. There were some raids, but they backed off because they knew that the labor was needed. What's going to happen when that labor is no longer needed? In the agricultural industry, which is what I know best, and I'm looking at the numbers in front of me, that the apple harvest this year was not slowed down at all. That the emergency rules that we tried to have implemented, because our organization has done enough work politically and organizing on the ground to actually create an oversight committee on the federal H-2A program, which is the balance that this country, the politicians and the rich people and the agricultural industry and the corporate leaders are moving towards. On the one end, figure out any way you can to deport the undesirables that you don't want in this country, but then figure out another way to bring in the labor that you need in a legal way, which is a quasi-slave labor force called the H-2A program. And the H-2A program, as people are being deported, is growing across the country. In the Deep South, of course, it's bigger than it is in the Northwest. But in Washington State, I believe in 2017 and 18, there were over 30,000 H-2A workers from Mexico brought in to Washington State. Some of them were brought in from Jamaica, and some of them were starting to be brought in from Indonesia and other parts of the world. So at the same time that they're deporting the skilled labor force of farm workers, they're bringing in another skilled labor force that's controllable, that have no rights to complain, no rights to strike, no right to organize, and that are contained in very remote labor camps, almost like prison camps, literally, where they cannot leave because the employer is holding their temporary worker visas. So these numbers have grown. This year with the pandemic, what we said, you are not ready to bring in the same number of workers because the labor camps are not up to par to protect those workers from COVID once they arrive. We demand that you sanitize the labor camps and that you restructure them in order to meet the COVID protocols to protect workers, which is social distancing, ventilation, and wearing masks in the transportation and everything. Well, we argued with them and fought with them from March 19 all the way into late June. And finally, there were emergency regulations that were implemented. And you know what they were? Almost word for word what the industry wanted. They allowed enough of a loophole in the regulations and what the industry wanted in terms of allowing H-2A workers into labor camps the way that they wanted, which was in bunk beds and then so-called cohort groups. And they still brought those workers in, the same number. Last year, they brought in 27,000. This year, they've got in 26,407 workers in the state now, without any reporting about where they're at, how they're doing, the number of deaths, and how they're taking care of them. All of the facts and the data on this are obfuscated, difficult to look at. So what I'm saying, or what I'm telling you all, in the way that community to community looks at this, is that let's not fool ourselves. And we don't want to get lost in the details of all of this immigration law. The fact is, there is no way for immigrants to legalize. And if there is, there are exceptions and they're very few. The law is specifically at every level written to keep our people out. And when that didn't happen because of so many good people that managed to get across the border and other folks like yourselves helping in protecting immigrant families running from violence and poverty, they then decided to basically get as cruel as they have to keep people out. And to do that, you've all seen the recent memos that the division, the taking away of children from their mothers and fathers was deliberately planned by Jeff Sessions and the Trump administration. They decided to do that, regardless of the law. They pushed to the maximum the amount of cruelty that they could wage on those innocent families in order to discourage people from coming into the United States. That is a fact now that we know is true. So we as a people in this country, and I am one of those people. I was born in Texas. I'm an American citizen. I am an American as well as a deep loyalty to my Mexican people and my Mexican family, my brothers and sisters. We have to decide that no matter what the law is, we are going to have to disobey because we are in a fascist government right now, and we cannot agree to what's happening to our people just because that's what the law says. The law is wrong. And that's what we ask as immigrant people and advocates, we have to at some point disobey. And I want to end this right now with the ask that we have of you. We are so close to fascism. We don't know what's going to happen at the election. I'm asking all of you, you need to ask the question of your local law enforcement, your sheriffs and your police chiefs about their relationship with Homeland Security agents, ICE agents and Border Patrol. Are they, in the county sheriffs especially, are they going to obey the mandates, any mandate that Homeland Security sends down for how they're going to, number one, deal with immigrant communities, and number two, deal with the advocates and the activists that are trying to protect immigrant communities and are trying to keep what shred of democracy is left in this country alive. We have to hold accountable. They are going to be the agents that are going to be sent to remove, hold hostage, and detain in unbearable conditions innocent immigrant families that are here in our country now. And we're in Whatcom County. We need to ask Sheriff Elfo, and he has to publicly tell us, what is your position if the chief of Homeland Security sends out a mandate to all county sheriffs and say, we want you to identify all of the illegal aliens and round them up and put them somewhere or identify them and tell us where they're at. Are we going to allow Sheriff Elfo to do that? He is an elected sheriff. All of these sheriffs across the country, they're either elected or appointed. We have to have them tell us now before the election. Before November 3rd, they need to take a position. Are they with the people or not? So I think that the moment has come when we're going to have to take really, really strong positions. And I really think that, you know, when you're talking about the death penalty in traffic court, there was a farm worker that died in the HOA program in Whatcom County. And you know where his death was finally adjudicated? In traffic court in Bellingham, Washington. So while you're talking about on the federal side, at the local level, people, a farm worker's life was dealt with in traffic court in Bellingham. So this is where we're at the local level. And I think we need to go all the way to our home courts and our home sheriffs and really take a close look and demand some answers. Thank you. I know I went over.
No, you're right on time.
Thank you, Rosalinda.
Because I could go on a long time on this, so.
I know. As I said, there's quite a bit of wisdom there, and quite a bit of experience as well.
I wanted
Hmm?
to go to the Dignity Campaign. There's a campaign webpage on the Dignity Campaign that has a very explicit and detailed comprehensive immigration reform platform. Developed by immigrants, yeah. The Dignity Campaign for Immigration Reform or something like that.
Real immigration reform?
I think so, yeah. It's got
Yeah.
some photos by David Bacon.
Thank you, Rosalinda. We'll pull that. We'll look it up and put it in the chat.
All right, thanks.
I just posted the Dignity Campaign website URL in the chat box. And so now we're going to head into the Q&A session. We've got 20 minutes.
Well, thank you to all three of our panelists. That was really informative and very deep. You clearly all have a lot of wisdom and breadth of experience, and I'm grateful for your presence here today. I invite us, before we go into Q&As, just to take a few breaths all together. So if we can just inhale and exhale. In and out. One more. just remembering that we're connected to each other and our shared humanity, even though we're physically distanced from each other.
Thank you.
And the first question that was sent to me is, and all of these are for all of the panelists, does anybody know how many active sanctuary churches there are in Washington? How many of those are Unitarian, Universalist, or other?
It was covered partially in the last session by one of the panelists who said that they would be providing resources for the participants on that.
Thank you, Sahar. Okay, and our next question, if you could speak to one transformative thing happening in your networks that's moving us all as a collective in the direction of immigration reform and justice, and what would that be?
I don't know if I can say transformative. And I guess in our organization and working with the Bellingham Unitarian Fellowship, that relationship is transformative in terms of the power, I guess, that the Bellingham Unitarian Fellowship congregation gives us as immigrants and families when we bring up an issue. The latest one has been the Immigration Advisory Board with the City of Bellingham, that after probably I think it was about 5 years of struggle, we managed to get that ordinance written and formed, because the city refuses to be a sanctuary city. So we do have an Immigration Advisory Board that we've just started, and it's yet to be proven whether that will be transformative. We're working, trying to change the structure in how the city deals with immigrant families and how they're going to control their police department and their county sheriffs from cooperating with Homeland Security and ICE.
So the experience we've had in Kitsap County is a year and a half or 2 years ago, we went to each city council and to the county government and asked them to pass welcoming city, welcoming community ordinances. And 2 of them did, Bremerton and Bainbridge Island. The other 3 we're still working on. But the other thing is we formed a pretty strong relationship with law enforcement in Kitsap and Jefferson counties. And the sheriffs and police chiefs in those counties have pretty much guaranteed that they are not going to cooperate with ICE unless they are made to do it through a law. And the experience we've had so far is that they have been really supportive of the immigrant communities in our area. And I will say that there have been some actions they've taken that I have been really positively amazed about. And so if anything that we've done down here might be of help to you, Rosalinda, maybe we can talk about that, because I'd be really happy to share it with you.
Thank you. I think it depends on what those activities are. I mean, I think that police and law enforcement do not have to obey the law. They can take actions. And I think that that's the problem, is when they say within the law, and the law is being changed so that they can do less and less. So it's their behavior as human beings towards other human beings that will really make the difference. But we'll see, you know. I'd like to talk to you and hear what some of those actions are.
Great. We can do
that. In terms of transformative relationships, I echo Rosalinda that the work is ongoing, and some of this it awaits to be seen what transformations result. But something that has been personally transformative for me has been the relationship with the TPS Alliance. Our partners there, UUSC, first started supporting them when they were just organizing, really before they had become a national organization or gotten underway. And they formed because so the way that TPS decisions work is that a country that's been designated for the status, which I mentioned provides a temporary shield from deportation. These are renewed in 18-month increments. And so after the Trump administration came to power, we sort of knew that there would be a staggered series of decisions coming up about whether they would extend TPS status for nationals of different countries that were experiencing natural disasters, like in Haiti, still recovering from the 2010 earthquake, or ongoing violence and political instability in different ways. And so there was this just incredibly disheartening period where every few months we'd have another one of these decisions come down of another country with, tens of thousands of people, many of whom who've been living in the United States for decades, who have US citizen children here, who have families and businesses, losing status potentially in the next few weeks because of the administration's refusal to extend the status. And TPS holders themselves took the initiative to organize, and it didn't have to play out that way because some nationalities have larger constituencies than others. El Salvador has the largest number of TPS holders in the country at more than 200,000 people. And then there are countries like Yemen and Syria that have only a couple thousand, very small number of people who have TPS in the country. And so there could have been negotiations to, well, maybe just El Salvador would be extended, but not others. Maybe some countries would. And TPS holders said, no, it's all of us or none of us, and we have to stay together, because if we start making those kinds of deals, nobody comes out a winner in the end. And they undertook this incredible effort of solidarity of how do you build power among 13 different nationalities who speak different languages, come from very different contexts, but have this one shared experience in common of being at risk from this administration's TPS policy. And they've been able to do it and establish TPS committees around the country that reflect the diversity of countries and genders, different experiences of people who have TPS. And they are also undeterred. We just had a very dismaying reversal in the Ninth Circuit around the ongoing litigation to try to protect TPS and stop the cancellation of the program. And people have said all along, it's not about the courts. It's Congress are the ones who provide permanent residency ultimately, and we're undeterred. We're continuing our efforts. And so I think it's been a lesson for me in solidarity, and what I take from it is how can we keep building outwards those concentric circles of solidarity and say more and more people that it's all of us or none of us. We cannot make decisions about whose rights get respected and whose don't.
Could I just say something about that? That for
Yes,
me,
please.
the transformation is that, part of the transformation is that you are following their lead. That I think that more impacted people will fight back if their struggle and their actions for liberation are supported by the white majority community. And I think that, that is the transformation ultimately of this nation, that the immigrant community take their place in the evolvement of the dream in the American Constitution. And I think that if, we could undo racism, and if white allies would follow the lead of brown and black people, whether they're immigrants or farm workers, to change this country, it will change and it will be better. And I think that that's really the dream of immigration, is the growth and the deepening richness of this country into the future. And so I think, when we're talking about immigrants and refugees, they're really not so much victims or submissive people that need help, but they will lead if we follow. And I think that's you're talking about, is that they united to fight and to stick together. And if we support them, those fights will get stronger and bigger. And out of that, we'll have something beautiful come out of it.
That's such a
Thank
powerful.
you for that.
I want to offer one quick thing too about solidarity and hope. I communicate with people who practice immigration law all over the country. And I would say towards the middle of this year, a lot of them were in despair because of the changes that kept coming and coming and coming. And many of them started to say, you know, I can't do this anymore. I'm just too beat down. And I was talking to several of my clients about that, and they said, how can you do that? How can they give up? We're here, we need them, we need to work together. And, you know, we started talking to each other, the accredited representatives and attorneys, and I shared that message from a couple of the clients. And I think it's really made a difference. I mean, you know, we're all kind of feeling like we're being beaten down, and at the same time we know that this country has been through this shit before, excuse me, and we have gotten over it. We've gotten through it and we've gotten better. And so we need to keep working to get better. And the things that Rosalinda's saying, to me, you know, that's the path. That's where we have to go.
Yeah, the last thing they want to hear is the law doesn't allow that. You can't do that because that's illegal. It's like, we know that. It's like the farm workers of Familias Unidas told us, they're from Oaxaca. They have come as far north as they can come, they said. This is it. We can't go anywhere else. We're here. And this is we're gonna take a stand, and we're all together, and the community supported them, including, you know, the Bellingham Unitarian Fellowship. And look at where they're at now. Over 700, 800 union members under collective bargaining, totally protected with good wages. I mean, totally transforming. I mean, that's a transformation. And I think we need to, you know, I ask of white allies, follow the leadership of the people that are impacted because they know how to lead their own destiny. We need to support that.
That victory was mostly you, Rosalinda.
Not without you all. Honestly, we can't win those kinds of victories in a vacuum. Believe that. We need you. We need you to act, to be bold. Don't follow the law all the time. The law is sometimes not good. Thank you. I don't know if there's any other questions.
There was a question for Josh to clarify what TPS is.
Sure. So co-panelists can speak to this as well, but it's short for temporary protected status. So it's a form of immigration status that was created legislatively in the 1990s, but it's basically set up for people who were in this country undocumented. If their country of origin is experiencing a humanitarian crisis from a natural disaster or a war or other cause, the government can designate that country for temporary protected status, which means that so long as that status is in place, people of that nationality in the U.S. are protected from being deported back to that country. It's a status that has been renewed for countries by both Republican and Democratic administrations, in some cases for decades. And, you know, among the countries that have been granted this status are, you know, Haiti because of the earthquake, El Salvador and Honduras originally because of Hurricane Mitch and other natural disasters. It was previously a politically uncontroversial thing and allowed hundreds of thousands of people to live here safely, but it fell into the crosshairs of the Trump administration's so-called America First policy, and ever since then, TPS holders have been organizing to try to prevent the administration from canceling the status and win a path to permanent status and ultimately citizenship here in the United States.
Thank you. I think we have time for one final question, and I'm sure each of you will have a different answer. So if you could keep your answer in a pearl, if at all possible. What is your biggest stumbling block or barrier after funding?
I would say it is the regulatory legal structure that exists from the local level to the federal level. And I'm just going to keep harping on that. It's the racist structure. And it's also not just with undocumented immigrants and immigrant community. That's what Black Lives Matter is talking about. It's the same racist legal structure that is allowing local police to kill Black people. It's the same racist legal police structure that is cooperating with Homeland Security. So I think it's just deep. It's deep, and it's a very detailed web of regulation and law.
I would say I agree with what Rosalinda said, but I also feel as though it's a lack of awareness by people in general in our communities. We struggle all the time to let people know about the work we're doing, but also about the situation that immigrants in our country are facing. And invariably, 90% of the people I talk to haven't got a clue about what's going on. And I believe that the change is going to come when enough people realize it, because people have the power to make a difference. And if we have enough people who want to make a difference, it'll happen.
I could just say that, kind of similarly, that I think the temptation to despair in the current political moment is very real for a lot of our members and for just people of conscience around the country. And I think what I come back to is remembering to follow the lead of people who have a much longer history of dealing with of having to call upon every possible resource for resilience within themselves, and people for whom democracy and human rights have never been a reality in this country, and following their lead and remembering that that's where the strength and the power of movements to resist come from. And so I take great inspiration from the words that you shared, Rosalinda, about what white allies such as myself are called to do in this moment.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you, Rosalinda. Thank you, Josh, very much. There's a lot to process there, and hopefully we can start working towards investigating and researching and learning and start preparing ourselves so that we can come up with some definitive strategies during the December session to support all of you in the various aspects of immigrant workers and immigration and migrant workers and asylum and refugees, and just our immigration policies in general. So let's keep our fingers crossed for the elections and hope all turns well. But regardless of what happens, at least in terms of who our next POTUS is, we've got a tremendous amount of work to do either way. So let's get ready to do it. We're going into a break. We will reconvene at 4 o'clock, where we will have our legislative advocacy panel. And this is going to be extremely important, I think, this next year in our efforts to deal with the myriad of the mess. Let's say, just say the mess that we're in right now. We'll have, and I see Representative Lickenoff is here already, and Lavona Grow will be joining us to talk about different aspects of what we can do on a legislative level and in a legislative advocacy. And it's going to be a critical point for all of our panels so far, whether we're talking about First Nations, whether we're talking about immigration, whether we're talking about racial justice, and whether or not we're talking about environmental justice. So that's going to be an important aspect coming up. So we'll see you all at 4 o'clock. Thank you very much for all being here, and I hope you stay on for the legislative component.